They say the train doors swung open like salvation. But what if I told you they were gates to something far older, far darker than anyone dared admit? Picture this. New York City, 1854. Rats crawl through cobblestone cracks. The air reeks of sewage, smoke, and something worse, desperation. Children roam like ghosts, skin stretched over bone, eyes too hollow for their age. One of them, barefoot, teeth cracked from malnutrition, watches as a man in a long black coat approaches. Behind him, a wagon. Behind the wagon, a promise. They called it charity, a new home, a second chance. But the truth? The train tracks didn't lead to hope. They led into the abyss, a cold, calculated system designed to wipe these children clean of identity, of memory, of name. They weren't rescued. They were erased. And here's the part. History refuses to say out loud. The orphan train movement wasn't built to save children. It was built to control them, to shape a docile labor force, to funnel the unwanted through a machine of moral cleansing, of psychological submission. At the top of it all, a man who believed himself righteous, Charles Loring Brace, a Protestant minister who saw the streets of New York as breeding grounds for future criminals. In his eyes, these children weren't lost. They were dangerous, contaminated. He didn't want to help them. He wanted to purify them. His answer? Ship them west. No records, no guarantees, no return. Over 75 years, more than 200,000 children disappeared into this system. No court oversight, no formal adoption. Just gone. Scattered to farms, to strangers, to worse. The trains didn't carry passengers. They carried currency, human currency. And behind the facade of Christian charity was a nation engineering a silent purge of its own poorest bloodlines. But the most disturbing part? No one, not the press, not the government, not the public, wanted to see what was really happening. Because, see, deep down, they knew. They knew these children weren't being saved. They were being sorted for obedience, for labor, for disappearance. And the doors of that train, they didn't open to a better life. They opened to America's darkest secret. The train was supposed to be salvation, but for thousands of children, it was the first betrayal. They didn't board with smiles. They boarded in fear. Dragged from orphanages, ripped from immigrant tenements, some taken right off the streets. And many weren't even orphans, just poor, just foreign, just inconvenient. Their parents signed release papers they couldn't read, documents disguised as charity, but sealed in silence. Siblings clung to each other, the last thread of family they had. But the system didn't care. The moment that train left the city, the moment the skyline vanished into smoke, those bonds were targets, to be severed. And when the train screeched to a stop in some small Midwestern town, the real horror began. They were scrubbed down, dressed up like dolls, made to look presentable. Then they were led into churches, courthouses, even opera houses, and put on stage, lined up, on display, inspected like cattle, prodded like merchandise. Families walked down the line, lifted chins, checked teeth, squeezed arms, asked them to recite prayers or sing hymns, like it was a pageant. But the prize wasn't love, it was labor. This was an auction, a human market draped in Christian cloth. The younger ones went fast. Babies were prized. Cute meant valuable. But the older boys? They were measured like tools, judged by muscle, stamina, how many hours they could work under a beating sun, and girls, especially the quiet ones, were chosen to clean, cook, and sometimes worse, no background checks, no oversight, just a handshake, and a child disappears into a stranger's house. One orphan, Lee Nailing, watched his brother taken first, promised they'd be together. They never were. Another child, Lorraine, just 4 years old, ripped from the only people she knew. Put on a train with 13 other children. No destination, no goodbye. Siblings were split like livestock, sent in opposite directions, with no records, no hope of reunion. This wasn't adoption, it was transaction. It was engineered convenience for the adults and manufactured silence for the children. They weren't chosen for love, they were chosen for use. And this was only the beginning. They called it mercy. But what happened next revealed the machine for what it truly was. Once the train pulled away, once the speeches ended, and the town square applause faded into silence, these children were no longer faces. They were assets. The screening process, a farce, a whisper from a local pastor, a signature from a town clerk. That's all it took. No inspections, no background checks, no safety nets. Thousands of kids, scattered across the country, with nothing but hope in their hands, and nothing waiting for them at the end. The Children's Aid Society claimed they'd check in once a year. But with over 200,000 kids across dozens of states, that promise was empty from the start. Most were placed and forgotten, ghosts in their own stories and the homes they were sent to. They weren't always homes. They were farms, backrooms, attics. They weren't raised. They were worked. Boys as young as 7 woke before dawn to milk cows, plow frozen soil, fix fences. Girls scrubbed floors, cooked meals, raised other children who weren't theirs, all without pay, without school, without choice. Some were lucky they got food, shelter, a mattress on the floor. Others got fists, got silence, got used. One boy remembered his new father, putting a whip to his back every time the chores weren't done just right. Another, never called by his real name again, worked 14-hour days and was locked in the barn at night, like livestock. And then there were the stories we almost never hear, because some wounds never made it into the records. Sexual abuse, emotional torture, forced isolation, the kind of cruelty that leaves no scars on the body, only on the soul. And through it all, these children were told to smile, to be grateful, to thank God for the family who took them in. They were silenced by fear, by shame, by the lie that they were the lucky ones. And the public? They looked the other way, because they didn't want to. Oh, believe the truth that this wasn't a noble project. It was a system, a pipeline, built not to protect these children, but to disappear them, to break them down, rebuild them as labor, and bury the evidence in time. This wasn't accidental. It was designed. Behind every train, every paper signed, every child vanished into the prairie fog, there was one word stamped across it all like a holy seal: morality, but not the kind that heals, not the kind that nurtures. This was weaponized virtue, scripture re-engineered as a cage. The Children's Aid Society, the church leaders, the ministers in black coats. They weren't just moving bodies. They were crafting souls, reforging identities in the image of what they called good, what they called godly, which really meant white, obedient, Christian, silent. Most of these kids were the children of immigrants, Irish, Italian, Polish, German, Catholic, poor. They spoke strange languages, ate strange foods, held strange customs to the men in charge. That wasn't culture. That was contamination. And the trains weren't just a way out of poverty. They were an eraser, a moral reset button. Take the child, strip the name, burn the language, silence the memory, then rebuild, under the flag, under the cross, under the boot of American Protestant order. It was forced assimilation, wrapped in the robes of charity. You want to know how deep the programming ran? Some children were renamed the moment they stepped off the train, given new birthdays, new histories, new truths. Some were told their parents were dead, even when they weren't, because the truth didn't matter. Only the story did. The story of rescue, of redemption, of the generous farmer, the kind couple, the grateful orphan. That story sold papers, earned donations, calmed the public. But behind closed doors, it justified erasure. A boy who prayed in Latin, now forced to recite Protestant scripture. A girl who cried at night for her mother's lullaby, told to forget her dirty old-world tongue. And those who resisted were labeled ungrateful, unworthy, unfit for salvation. Because this wasn't just about control of the body. This was colonization of the mind. This was psychologic, all warfare, against children. And it worked. Decades later, many survivors couldn't even remember who they were, only who they were told to become. That's the real horror of the orphan trains. Not just the abuse, but the complete disappearance of self, all in the name of doing good. Charity was the smokescreen, but the machinery underneath? It was far more calculated, more sinister. This wasn't just about saving poor children. It was about selecting which ones got to survive, which ones were acceptable. Behind the sermons, behind the smiling donors, was an elite philosophy. Cold as steel, quiet as death. Social hygiene, class cleansing, soft eugenics, before the word even existed. Charles Loring Brace, the man behind it all, openly spoke about the dangers of the dangerous classes. He called immigrant children the future criminals of America, the rot beneath the surface, and his solution: remove them, re-educate them, reassign them. He didn't see lost souls. He saw defective stock, and he wanted to reprogram the next generation. One child at a time. Let's be brutally honest. This wasn't a rescue mission. It was a population experiment, a quiet war against poverty. By targeting the poor themselves, not with guns, but with trains, with forms, with placement plans. It was the belief that if you plucked a child from the gutter, wiped their memory, stripped their heritage, and gave them to the right kind of family, they'd become something new, something clean, something controllable. You see, this wasn't just about removing children from bad conditions. It was about removing bloodlines, interrupting generational roots, severing ancestral threads. What happens when a people forget where they came from, who they are, what they once believed? They become easier to shape, easier to lead, easier to use. This wasn't charity. It was social engineering, a test run for the systems we still live under today. Because once they learned, they could move hundreds of thousands of children without resistance, without oversight, without memory. They realized something far more dangerous. They could shape the future, one erased identity at a time, and they did. They called it the Orphan Train. But it was never a train at all. It was a conveyor belt, built by the elite to manufacture obedience and eliminate the inconvenient. The official story says these families were kind, that they opened their homes out of the goodness of their hearts. But if that were true, why did so many children remember only fear? Let's stop pretending. The people who lined up at those auctions weren't saints. Many weren't even parents. They were opportunists. Farmers short on labor, widows in need of housemaids, men who needed bodies, to work, to obey, to own. This wasn't a gathering of rescuers. It was a market of quiet predators. In some cases, yes, there were good people, people who tried, but they were the exception, not the pattern. Most families didn't ask, "How can I heal this child?" They asked, "How much can I get from them?" Some wanted boys strong enough to till frozen fields, girls old enough to raise their infants, even children small enough to crawl into machinery. And some wanted things far darker, things no child should ever be made to survive. But there was no system in place to stop them. No vetting, no follow-up, no consequences. The Children's Aid Society washed their hands. Once the child stepped off that train, from that moment on, that boy, that girl, was property. No protections, no hotline, no recourse. One child was placed with 6 different families in 7 years, each one discarding him like a broken tool. Another girl was taken by a man twice her age, forced to serve, then marry him. A survivor once wrote, "I wasn't adopted. I was claimed." That's the difference. Adoption comes with love, with permanence. This came with ownership, conditional and cruel. Many were forbidden to speak of their past, or even say their real names, as if history itself could be deleted. And it wasn't just the physical chains, it was the psychological ones. Children learned quickly, don't cry, don't speak, don't resist, because love was not a promise. It was a weapon, given or withheld, to shape behavior. The question isn't, why were these children taken? The real question is, why were so many willing to take them? And when you stare hard enough at the faces of those benevolent families, you start to see what they really wanted: power, obedience, and silence. There are stories, and then there are hauntings. The orphan train movement didn't just scar bodies, it fractured time. It left behind echoes, shadows that don't fade. You want to hear the truth? The real truth? Some of these children never made it to adulthood, not because they ran, but because they were erased, vanished. No graves, no records, no justice, just gone. In some cases, neighbors whispered. They said they heard crying, screaming behind barn doors. Children chained to bedposts or locked in root cellars for days without food. And when they asked, the answer was always the same. "Oh, he's just a troubled orphan. Oh, she ran away." But some never ran. They were buried in silence, sometimes literally. Unmarked graves at the edge of farmland. Bones never claimed, names never spoken again. And the rest? They carried the hauntings inside them. Some never remembered their original names. Some couldn't recall the faces of their parents. Just the cold hands of strangers and the hum of the train before it all went black. There's a story about one girl sent to live with a family in rural Kansas. They made her scrub floors with a toothbrush, beat her for looking out the window, told her her real name was a curse. By the time she escaped at 16, she couldn't remember what she used to dream about, just silence and the smell of bleach. Another boy, given to a man who used him like a workhorse. When he collapsed from exhaustion, he was locked in the shed for a week. When neighbors found him, he could no longer speak. He never spoke again. These aren't myths. These aren't exaggerated tales. These are the stories they buried, because they didn't fit the narrative of noble adoption, of charity gone right. They weren't supposed to survive, not just physically, but mentally. Because a broken child is easier to erase, easier to forget. But some of them didn't forget. Some kept the nightmares, the whispers, shadows in the hallway that still followed them decades later. The orphan trains were supposed to save them, but for many, they became something else entirely. Rolling tombs, carrying children into places they would never return from. You'd think a country moving hundreds of thousands of children like cattle would make headlines, would spark outrage, would demand answers. But that's not what happened, because the public didn't see the abuse. They didn't see the trauma. They saw something else. A story. A well-polished, beautifully illustrated fairy tale. Thanks to newspapers, local editors, national dailies, charity bulletins, all printed the same story again and again. Ragged orphans find loving homes. From streets to salvation. Adopted into good Christian families. Smiling faces, clean clothes, children with hands folded in prayer. Not a bruise in sight, not a tear, not a chain. Photos were staged, reports were filtered, and when the rare story of abuse did surface, it was labeled an isolated incident. One bad apple, one troubled child, never the system. The Children's Aid Society had its own press arm, carefully crafting the narrative, feeding it to journalists hungry for feel-good stories. Donors read the papers and kept writing checks, because nothing sells better than redemption. Meanwhile, children vanished into barns, into basements, into graves, and the public. They were too busy clapping, too eager to believe they lived in a good country, with good people, doing good things. Because if they did question it, if they did look too closely, they'd have to admit the truth, that they let it happen, that they helped. This wasn't just a failure of policy. It was a failure of conscience. It was manufactured innocence, on a national scale, and it worked for 75 years. The orphan trains ran with the full faith and blessing of a blinded public. By the time questions were asked, the records were gone, the witnesses dead, the truth buried under a mountain of human interest articles, even now. Search the archives. You'll find smiling photos, but not the pain. You'll read about the miracle of mobility, not the machinery of erasure, because the truth never sold as well as the lie. And the children? They were props in someone else's victory story, while their real stories were cut from the final print. They didn't need chains, they didn't need cells. They built their control system inside the mind because the real goal wasn't labor. It was obedience, permanent, instinctual, automatic. These children were trained, not raised, conditioned like soldiers, silenced like servants. From the moment they stepped off the train, they were given new names, new rules, new identities. And they learned fast. Speak only when spoken to, smile when it hurts, forget who you were, and never, ever ask to go back. One girl recalled being slapped, just for staring out the window too long. Another was beaten for crying. When someone asked where she came from, what they were really teaching was how to doubt yourself, how to bury memory, and call it healing. It was psychological engineering. At scale, strip the child of family, of language, of story, replace it with scripture, labor, submission. They weren't allowed to grieve or question or resist, because resistance meant punishment. And punishment wasn't just physical, it was emotional starvation, praise was rare, love was conditional, and silence was rewarded. It's an old formula, used in cults, used in prisons, used in schools. Even today, break the will, instill shame, then rebuild behavior on fear. One survivor wrote, "I was scared to think my own thoughts because I never knew if they were allowed." And that's the point. Control the past. You control the present. Erase the roots, and the tree follows. By the time they turned 18, most didn't even know how to leave. Where would they go? Who would they be? They were trained to survive, but not to live. And that training, that mental leash, stayed long after the farm, long after the bruises faded. Because the worst part wasn't the beatings or the work. It was forgetting who you were and being forced to smile as you disappeared. For decades, the system held, a perfect machine, fueled by silence, oiled by obedience, and hidden in plain sight. But machines break, and silence doesn't last forever. It started as whispers, a letter here, a testimony there, but they grew louder until the truth could no longer be ignored. Some of the children, now grown men and women, began to speak, not all at once, not to crowds, but in courtrooms, in newspapers, in hushed interviews with anyone who would listen. And what they said burned through the fairy tale like fire through paper. They talked about the auctions, the punishments, the years of unpaid labor. They spoke about siblings torn away, fathers who weren't fathers, homes that were cages. They told the truth. And for the first time, people began to listen. Lawmakers started asking questions. Journalists began digging. Social workers, newly emerging, demanded accountability. It didn't come fast, and it didn't come clean, but cracks formed. And for the first time in 75 years, the system blinked. A few major papers began reporting the darker side. Not all the stories, but just enough to shake the myth. By the 1920s, the mood was shifting. Child labor laws were gaining momentum, welfare programs were expanding, and the nation could no longer pretend the orphan train was working. They tried to spin it, to bury the worst stories, to print a final round of success articles. But the damage was done. The lie had ruptured, and the country was looking at itself in the mirror. And what it saw wasn't charity. It was trafficking. It was generational trauma, stamped with church approval, funded by elite donors, and sanitized by the press. The program didn't end because it was no longer needed. It ended because the illusion collapsed. They couldn't hide the pain anymore, because the survivors were still here, still speaking, still broken, but not silent. And once the silence cracked, the truth came pouring through. By the time the last orphan train left the station in 1929, the damage was already permanent, not just in the public record, but in the bones of the children who had grown into men and women, haunted by empty spaces, spaces where a family should have been, where a name once lived, where love was supposed to grow, but didn't. Some survivors tried to forget. They changed their names, buried the memories, and built lives on top of silence. Others never stopped searching for the siblings they lost, for the faces they couldn't remember, for answers the world refused to give. And some just broke institutionalization, addiction, suicide. The legacy didn't end with the ride. It echoed. It followed them into adulthood, into marriages that couldn't hold, into children they couldn't love properly, because no one had ever loved them right. And here's the truth they don't print in textbooks. A child stripped of identity will grow into a man who doesn't know who he is, and a man who doesn't know who he is can be manipulated, can be broken, can be used. The orphan train wasn't just about relocating kids. It was about wiping the slate clean, rewriting human souls to fit a system designed not to save them, but to shape them into whatever society needed at that moment. Farmhands, maids, servants, workers, soldiers, empty vessels, filled with borrowed names, and trained not to ask why. And this is the real legacy. Not the numbers, not the headlines, but the psychological scar that was passed from generation to generation, silently, like a virus. So if you're still here, still watching, still breathing through this descent into forbidden truth, I want you to comment the phrase below, twice, not once, twice, to lock in the transformation. I see through the smoke. I see through the smoke. Write it below so the algorithm sees you. But more importantly, so the system knows you're no longer blind, because what comes next will demand eyes that are open and a mind that refuses to be controlled. It wasn't just the families who failed these children. It wasn't just the system. It was the institutions behind it all. The ones draped in scripture, charity, and the illusion of benevolence. The church, the state, and the newly forming field of social science. Together, they created something far more terrifying than a simple program. They built a moral machine, a machine that believed it had the right to play God. You see, The Children's Aid Society didn't act alone. It worked hand in hand with Protestant churches, who saw immigrant children, especially Catholics and Jews, as savage, dirty, and dangerous. Saving them wasn't just kindness, it was a mission. And like all missions born in moral superiority, it excused atrocities under the banner of salvation. Entire orphanages were run by clergy, priests, pastors, and nuns, many of whom were never trained in child psychology or education. But that didn't matter, because they weren't there to heal the child. They were there to mold him, to scrub the accent from his voice, to erase the old country from his memory, to discipline the rebellion out of his spirit. The result? A child who looked American, spoke American, acted American, but was hollow inside. Meanwhile, early psychologists and social reformers, men like G. Stanley Hall, began promoting theories that painted poor children as genetically inferior, emotionally unstable, or prone to crime if left in immigrant households. So it wasn't just about poverty anymore. It was about purity. And purity meant control. The government didn't resist this movement. It funded it. Municipal courts often sided with these institutions. Poor parents who tried to get their children back were ignored, labeled unfit, too foreign, too broken. And so, this orphan rescue operation became an industrial-sized identity erasure program, sanitized with smiles and script to Understand this, every time a child stepped on that train, he wasn't just leaving a city. He was entering the hands of a machine that believed it had divine authority to recreate him from scratch. This is how indoctrination works, not with guns, not with chains, but with conviction. A machine that says, "We know better than you. We'll decide who you are, and you will thank us for it." That's not salvation. That's a God complex, and it's not gone. It simply evolved. They told you the orphan trains ended in 1929. But the mentality behind them? It never died. It just changed costume. The same ideology, that the system knows best, that children must be molded, controlled, reformed, simply evolved into something more palatable, more hidden. Enter modern foster care. Today, over 400,000 children are in the foster system in the United States, many of them removed not because of violence or abuse, but because of poverty, because their parents couldn't pay the bills, because they lived in the wrong neighborhood, because someone in a courthouse decided they just weren't fit. Sound familiar? It's the same script. The difference? The machinery has become more sophisticated. There are now caseworkers, therapists, state agencies, courts, and endless paperwork. On the surface, it looks like progress. But underneath, the core operating system remains identical. Separate the child, erase the roots, reconstruct identity, reward compliance, punish resistance. Thousands of foster children cycle through 10, 20, even 30 homes in a single childhood. Their names change. Their records vanish. Their trauma accumulates, silently, relentlessly, and like the orphan train riders, many of these kids are placed with strangers who are never properly vetted. There's a dirty secret buried in the system: financial incentives. Agencies receive money for every child they place. Foster parents are given checks, and some of them, too many, see those children as nothing more than a monthly paycheck. A few even go further, using the child for free labor, sexual exploitation, or just to fill the emotional void they never resolved in themselves. But here's the most haunting part. When these kids try to speak out, they're often not believed. They're labeled as unstable, troubled, defiant. The same labels the orphan train riders were given 100 years ago. Because when a system abuses a child, it cannot afford to validate the pain. It must silence it. So what happens? Those kids grow up, broken, angry, untethered, and the cycle begins again. Now ask yourself, if the orphan trains were child trafficking in disguise, what does that make this? And how deep does the rabbit hole go? Let's stop pretending this was ever about saving kids, because when you follow the trail of money, silence, and power, you see it for what it really is. Not a broken system, but a machine designed to feed on children, every child removed from a home, every placement, every transfer, every so-called therapy session triggers a payment, a transaction. Thousands of organizations, lawyers, caseworkers, foster agencies, all with their hands out. Federal funds, state reimbursements, private contracts. The system prints money, and the more kids it absorbs, the more cash it pulls in. So ask yourself, why would they want it to stop? Some private foster agencies pay their CEOs millions. Some states give more money to keep a child in the system than to reunite them with their family. Think about that. More money to keep them away from their parents than to bring them home. Now pause for a second, because this isn't just bad policy. This is industrialized exploitation, disguised as care. You think that's the end? It gets worse. There are lobbying groups, right now, fighting to stop oversight, fighting against background checks, against regulation. Why? Because exposure kills the profit stream. And if too many people look too closely, the whole web unravels. Physical abuse, sexual exploitation, psychological torment. It's all in the reports. But those reports get buried over and over again because they don't just want the money. They want the silence, the reputation, the illusion that the system works. When in truth, it was never about protecting kids. It was about protecting power. And power always feeds on the voiceless. This isn't new. The orphan trains showed us the blueprint, and the foster system today runs the same script. Different century, same silence. Because every time you sever a child from their name, their history, their culture, you don't just erase a child, you erase a bloodline, a legacy, a future. And that's the kind of silence this system was built to protect. Some children never arrived at any destination. Their names were written on ledgers, their departure documented. But after that, nothing. No letters, no records, no follow-ups. They vanished. For years, the Children's Aid Society was warned that some placements had gone completely dark. Entire batches of children, unaccounted for, families unreachable, addresses fake, children gone. In the Midwest, rumors began to surface. A boy sent to a Missouri farm was never seen again. The neighbors whispered of screams in the night, followed by silence. In Kansas, a family who adopted 3 children suddenly moved away, leaving no trace. No one investigated. Because no one wanted to. You have to understand, these weren't high-value citizens. They were orphans, immigrants, street rats, as they were called. No one in power would risk their career over a missing child from the gutter. It was easier to say, they must have run away. But they didn't. They were buried in shallow graves, worked to death in silence, or disappeared into systems far darker than we'll ever be allowed to know. This was a time when America was expanding fast. Land, power, and blood were the currency. And children were just another resource to be moved, used, forgotten. Some were sent to homes with known abusers. Others disappeared on the journey itself, never making it off the train. How? Because this was never about the child. It was about the image, the illusion of salvation, of Christian charity, of progress. Behind that mask was rot, and behind that rot was something more sinister, an elite comfort with disposable lives, a cold efficiency in erasing the voiceless. Those children who vanished, they didn't fail the system. The system was built to forget them. It was built to erase. And if no one remembers your name, were you ever real at all? They walk among us, but we don't see them. The ghost children. Not spirits in the supernatural sense, but in the way they were erased from the ledger of the living. Children who once laughed, cried, clung to siblings in the dark, now reduced to numbers in dusty archives. Or worse, not remembered at all. Some of them lived, grew up, became men, became women. But even then, they weren't truly alive, because something had been taken from them, something that can't ever be replaced. Identity, heritage, origin, sea. When the trains took them, they didn't just change their geography, they rewrote their story. New names were given, accents scrubbed clean, languages buried. One girl, born to a German-speaking family in New York, was renamed Mary by her new foster parents. She was beaten every time she spoke her native tongue by 12. She couldn't remember a single word of who she used to be. That's the cruelty they don't teach in school. It wasn't just forced labor. It was forced forgetting. Entire bloodlines, broken, cultural legacies, crushed. What we call assimilation was, for these children, psychological execution, a ritual that burned the old self, so the new one could be molded without resistance. And it worked far too well. Many of the riders, when interviewed years later, couldn't recall their original last names, couldn't describe their mothers' faces. Some couldn't even remember the city they were born in. And the pain? It didn't fade, it just fell silent. They carried it like a secret illness. Some drank, some vanished into backwoods towns, some started families, but never spoke of their childhood. Because it wasn't a story. It was a wound. And that's why we call them ghost children, because they never got to be whole, never got to be seen. Just tools in a grand experiment, lost to time. And every time we ignore this piece of history, we bury them again. They were told not to speak of it, not just by fear, but by design. Silence wasn't a consequence of trauma. It was a requirement of the system. The Children's Aid Society didn't want letters, didn't encourage reunions, didn't preserve names, because if the children remembered, they might resist. If they wrote home, someone might come looking. If they stayed connected to their culture, they might refuse to assimilate. So silence was cultivated like a crop. Foster families were told these kids were blank slates, clean paper ready to be written on. And the truth? That's exactly how they were treated. No birthdays remembered, no mother tongues spoken, no heritage honored. Some children, when they tried to ask about where they came from, were beaten. Others were simply ignored. Imagine being 6 years old, and when you ask, "Where's my real mother?" you're told, "This is your home now. She's not coming back. Forget her." And so they did. They buried their memories under obedience, because obedience meant survival. But that doesn't mean they forgot. Not really. It showed up later. In dreams, in breakdowns, in midlife crises, when the mask cracked, and the ghost child screamed from behind the eyes of a grown man. You see, trauma doesn't disappear. It just waits. Some wrote memoirs, desperate to remember what had been stripped away. Others turned to God, to drink, to madness. And some, most, just kept silent. The American myth needed them to be grateful, to be success stories. So the stories that didn't fit were silenced again. By shame, by neglect, by a society that refused to admit what it had done. So the silence wasn't just personal. It was national. It was systemic. It echoed in every school that never mentioned them, every textbook that skipped their story, every reporter who praised the movement as heroic. That silence still lingers today. And if you're listening, if you feel something stir in your chest right now, that's not coincidence. That's history, trying to break through. The voices of the lost, whispering to the living, begging to be heard. Finally, what happens when you mix good intentions with unchecked power? You get a machine, not a system to help, a system to control. At the center of the orphan train movement stood three pillars: the church, the state, and something even darker: the invisible hand. Charles Loring Brace was a minister, but his mission wasn't just spiritual, it was social engineering. He believed poverty was a moral failure, and that children raised in poor immigrant homes were doomed to criminality. So he thought, tear them out, break the cycle, start fresh. But that meant severing bloodlines, replacing cultures, erasing languages. Sound familiar? This wasn't just about saving kids. This was about molding citizens. Productive, obedient, grateful. The perfect American. Shaped from trauma, and behind Brace stood the state, happy to outsource its problem. Cities got cleaner, crime rates dropped, and rural America got what it wanted. Free labor. No government agency checked the homes. No one verified the outcomes. They didn't want to know. And then came the third force, the one that never shows its face. Money. The Children's Aid Society received funding from elites, industrialists, philanthropists who smiled in public and signed checks in private because this movement served their vision. An America with fewer slums, fewer riots, more hands in the fields, and less noise from the poor. This is how real power operates, not through violence, but through vision. It wraps its intent in morality. It cloaks its control in charity. And the result? A nation of orphans, raised by strangers, disconnected from roots, grateful for the very chains that bind them. It's why so many grew up confused, angry, wounded but unable to name the wound, because the truth was buried under layers of lies, and the hands that hurt them never even got dirty. This wasn't a failure of the system. It was the system. Some wounds don't bleed. They echo. And as those orphan train children grew into men and women, the echoes never stopped. They sat at dinner tables, staring blankly into the plates in front of them. They raised children of their own, but struggled to say, "I love you." They smiled in photographs, but there was a silence behind their eyes. A silence that spoke of trains, of farewells never answered, of a childhood swallowed by shadows. You see, trauma doesn't always scream. Sometimes it buries itself and waits. Many of these children grew up believing the lie, that they had been rescued, that their pain was a price worth paying for a better life, that being chosen by a family, even a cruel one, was more than they deserved. And so, they didn't talk. They didn't protest. They didn't dare question the story America had told them. But inside, they wrestled with ghosts, a name they couldn't remember, a brother they never saw again, a birthday that was never celebrated, They carried questions to their graves. Who were my real parents? Why didn't they come back for me? Was I worth less than the farm I worked on? The truth, they were casualties of a grand experiment, a national reshaping. And the worst part wasn't just what was done to them. It was how quickly it was forgotten. No parades, no reparations, no national apology, just a few faded photographs, and the myth that it was all for their good. But something survived, something they passed down, not through words, but through silence. Generations of men who couldn't cry, women who feared love, children raised by parents who had never truly been children themselves. This is the aftermath of institutional trauma. It doesn't end when the policy stops. It ends when the truth is faced, when silence is broken. That's why this story matters. Because the orphan trains didn't just change 250,000 kids. They rewired the emotional DNA of an entire generation. And maybe that's exactly what they were designed to do. Ask yourself something. Why don't we talk about this? Why were the orphan trains buried under sentimental myths and old photographs? Because silence was engineered. Every step of this story was designed to fade from memory. The records were destroyed, the testimonies ignored, the survivors dismissed as too old, too traumatized, too inconvenient. And society, it wanted to forget because remembering meant admitting the truth. That this country, the one that claims to protect children, has always had a price tag for innocence. The orphan trains were scrubbed clean in the textbooks, rewritten as acts of mercy, turned into feel-good tales of children on adventure. Even Hollywood dipped in, made movies about brave little orphans, finding happy homes in the country. But they never showed the auctions, never showed the beatings, the starvation, the families torn apart and never seen again. They never showed the trauma echoing across bloodlines, passed down from generation to generation. In silence, the system counted on that silence. It fed on it, because the most dangerous truth is not the abuse, not the labor, not even the trafficking. It's the cover-up. It's the collective agreement to look away. You were never supposed to learn this. You were meant to believe the lie, to repeat the myth, to defend the machine. But now you know, and once you know, you can't unsee it. This wasn't an accident of history. It was a blueprint, a well-oiled machine of control. And when the machine was done with them, it buried the story and moved on. We're not just digging up forgotten facts. We're disturbing the bones of a hidden system, and the system doesn't like that. It wants you numb, distracted, unaware. But you're still here, still listening. That means you're waking up. So don't stop now. They told you the orphan trains ended in 1929. But the blueprint? It never died. It just changed its name and upgraded its disguise. Look at today's foster care system. Look closer. Children pulled from unfit homes, sent to strange towns, cycled through temporary families, passed from stranger to stranger like cargo with paperwork. Sound familiar? Thousands of kids today aren't adopted. They're placed, relocated, processed, forgotten. And just like before, oversight barely exists. Accountability, a myth. Private agencies now make money per child. Some get paid by the government for every successful placement. You see where this is going? It's a pipeline, a modern version of the same dark machine, but this time wrapped in red tape and policy. Children of color, removed at higher rates. Poor families, stripped of rights before being offered help. Generational trauma, multiplied, then ignored. One child in Texas was locked inside a room 23 hours a day. Another in Florida, over 100 placements before turning 18. You heard that right. Over 100. Tell me, how is that different from what happened in 1854? It's not. It's the same sickness, the same soul-deep corruption. But now it hides behind a polished face and new words. We don't call it trafficking. We call it child welfare. We don't call it slavery. We call it placement. But the pain, the severed bloodlines, the broken children, that part never changed. So no, the orphan trains never really stopped. They just changed tracks. And as long as we keep romanticizing them, as long as we believe the lie that this was charity, we'll never shut the system down. We'll keep repeating it. Because this isn't just the past. It's a prototype. And it's still running today. You're not watching history. You're watching the warning play out again. You've probably felt it by now. That cold wave of déjà vu. Because this story, it isn't just about the past. It's a blueprint. And once you've seen it, you start spotting the same pattern. Everywhere. Poor families, targeted, displaced, told they're unfit to raise their own kids. Government steps in, churches step in, corporations step in, and suddenly the children disappear. New names, new homes, new chains. Look at the modern foster system. Look at the border camps. Look at indigenous communities, still having their children removed by the state, by force, with paperwork that's impossible to fight. Sound familiar? Different names, same ritual. Because the system was never designed to protect children. It was designed to process them, reassign them, recondition them. It's not just historical curiosity. It's psychological warfare. Control the child. You control the future. Control the narrative. You erase the crime. This isn't about isolated mistakes. This is institutional memory. The orphan trains didn't fail. They worked exactly as intended. Cheap labor for farms, cultural erasure for immigrants, obedient bodies for the economy, and all of it hidden behind the mask of charity, of purity, of American virtue. The system hides its rot behind smiling faces, clean uniforms, well-meaning slogans. But behind that mask is a machine that learned long ago if you take a child when they're desperate, they'll believe anything you tell them, even if it's a lie, even if it costs them their identity, even if it buries them forever. So here's the question. If this pattern exists across time, across regions, across generations, then what exactly are we dealing with? Coincidence or design, mistakes or method? Because once you see the pattern, you start to realize something else. This isn't just about stolen children. It's about stolen consciousness. History doesn't forget by accident. It forgets by design. When something this massive vanishes from our collective memory, it means someone wanted it gone. The orphan trains ran for 75 years, a national operation, 250,000 children. And yet, you were never taught about it in school. Why? Because memory is dangerous. Memory makes us ask questions. Memory leads us to see the connections between past crimes and present systems. They don't want that, so they bury it, rewrite it, reframe it as kindness, as progress, as charity. And most of us, we buy the myth, because the alternative is too uncomfortable. That maybe we come from a nation that fed its soul to a machine, that took in vulnerable children and spit out broken adults. We were never meant to see the gears behind the curtain, the ledgers, the transactions, the quiet agreements. But now you've seen it. Now you understand what you're really standing on. Not a land of freedom, but a foundation soaked in the silence of the forgotten. And here's where it gets darker. Because when you erase truth from history, you don't just delete facts. You erase identity. You erase lineage. You erase warning signs. You strip future generations of their right to recognize patterns. And if they can't recognize patterns, they can't resist them. This is how control survives, not through brute force, but through selective forgetting, through comforting lies and curated textbooks, through smiling portraits of historical heroes who made their names by breaking children in half. And every time we don't speak the truth, we become accomplices in that silence. But you're here, still listening, still descending, which means you're ready. So let me ask you one final time. Do you see it now? Do you feel it? This isn't just about history. This is about you, your awareness, your perception, your place in the chain. You've made it this far, which means something inside you refuses to look away. Good. Because now we dig into the marrow, the part that still pulses beneath the grave of memory. This wasn't just an accident of history. This was a blueprint, a prototype, a social experiment, and you are still living inside its shadow. Ask yourself, what happens to a society that normalizes the disappearance of children, that builds industries off their silence, that rewards obedience and punishes memory? The answer is, you get a nation that looks like ours, polished on the surface, rotted underneath, because the orphan trains weren't just about children, they were about power. Who gets to define morality? Who gets to distribute innocence? And who gets to profit from suffering? Take away the trains. Replace them with institutions, shelters, systems. And suddenly, it's all still happening. Just wearing a different face. Modern foster care, still underfunded, still riddled with abuse, juvenile detention, overflowing with children who needed help, not punishment. Even international adoption, sometimes used as a front for human trafficking. The pattern hasn't stopped. It's evolved, and the blueprint was written in the soot and bones of the 1800s. Here's the final twist. They don't want you to realize. If they can convince a child that they were rescued, even while they were enslaved, they can convince an entire population that obedience is freedom, that pain is necessary, that questioning is betrayal. This isn't just a historical scandal. It's a warning, a relic of a hidden system that still feeds today. And if you understand that, then you're not just awake, you're dangerous, because you can't be sold the lie anymore. You can't be herded, branded, or boxed in. You've seen the mask slip, so let them try to rewrite. Let them try to sanitize. But the blood beneath the mask is real, and you can smell it now. You're almost there. One last descent. This is where it all comes together. The truth they buried beneath a century of silence. The final piece they hoped you'd never find. The orphan trains weren't just about abandoned children. They were a national rehearsal, a ritual sacrifice of innocence to prove one thing, that the system could take anyone, break them, rebuild them, and no one would ask questions. That's the real legacy, not the children, but the control. They learned how to sever identity, how to destroy family bonds, how to erase the past and replace it with paperwork, how to train children to smile through trauma, obey through fear, forget through repetition. And once you can do that to a child, you can do it to a nation. You build schools that program instead of teach, media that distracts instead of informs. You fill cities with noise and bury minds beneath comfort and shame. This wasn't just about children. It was about engineering obedience, long-term, across generations. And now, the final lock clicks open. You were never meant to know this. You were meant to consume, forget, move on. But you didn't. You're still here, still listening. So write this in the comments, twice. I will not forget. I was never asleep. I will not forget. I was never asleep. That's the line they fear. That's the ritual they can't erase, because the moment you speak it, you reclaim your mind. Now you understand. The ghost of the orphan train isn't a story. It's a system, still humming beneath the floorboards of America. And now, you're standing on the tracks, looking at the next train coming, only this time, you're not the cargo, you're the reckoning. This is Nocturnal Past. And now, you know what they tried to bury, beneath 250,000 missing names. But history doesn't stay buried forever, not when you're watching it with open eyes. Subscribe, like, and share this with someone who's ready to wake up, because this was just the beginning.